The morning the cats came was a Tuesday in November of 1998. I remember the air had that particular cold to it, the kind that feels like it's coming off a sheet of frozen steel left out in a field overnight. The sky was the color of old tin, and the wind had a low whistle to it as it came across the picked-over corn stubble. It wasn't a day for new beginnings. It was a day for hunkering down, for checking the caulk around the window panes and making sure the woodshed was full. But the county shelter truck came up the lane anyway, kicking up a little dust that the wind immediately snatched away. It was an old Ford with a rattling cage assembly on the back, and the woman who got out looked just as tired as the vehicle she was driving. She had a clipboard, but she didn't seem to have much faith in it. She looked at the barns, at the silos, then at me. She said, "You're the one who called." I told her I was. She went to the back and opened the latches on 20 individual wire cages. One by one, 20 cats blinked in the flat gray light. They weren't kittens. There wasn't a cute one in the bunch. These were the hard cases, the ones nobody wants. Tabbies with torn ears, a few long-haired ones with matted fur, a couple of skinny black cats that looked like they were made of wire and shadow. They were the ones who'd been trapped behind diners or born in drainage pipes. The shelter couldn't adopt them out. They were too wild, too feral, not house pets. They were scheduled to be put down on Friday. The woman had told me that on the phone. 20 of them. I'd told her to bring them all. She opened the last cage, and a big ginger Tom with a flattened nose and one eye gave me a long, unblinking stare before melting into the shadows under the corn crib. The others followed. Within a minute, the lane was empty again. The woman handed me the clipboard. "You just have to sign here. Says you're taking responsibility. Food, water, shelter. We don't ask questions after this." I signed the form. She didn't look at me with gratitude. She looked at me with a kind of weary pity. She probably figured I was a lonely old man collecting strays to fill up the silence. She wasn't entirely wrong about the lonely part, but she was dead wrong about the reason. I slid the barn door open a few inches for them and set out 2 wide, low pans of water near the old stock tank. That was all I was going to do for them for a while. They had to find their own way. As the shelter truck rattled back down the lane, my neighbor's pickup appeared, coming the other way. Dale's truck was always clean. Too clean for a man who claimed to work the land. He pulled up to the fence line, rolled down his window, and killed the engine. He just sat there for a minute, watching me. Dale's a good neighbor in the practical sense. He'll help you pull a calf or lend you a post hole digger. But he's a man who believes in what's new, what's certified, what comes with a warranty. He thinks I'm a relic. He's polite about it, but it's there. "Morning," he said. I nodded back. "Saw the county truck," he said, letting the statement hang in the air. "Just dropping something off," I said. Dale scanned the farmstead, his eyes sharp. He didn't see anything. Of course he didn't. They were already gone. Blended into the landscape. "Heard at the coop you were looking for barn cats," he said. "Figured you meant 1 or 2. I didn't answer. I just picked up one of the empty water buckets. 20, he said, not as a question, but as a fact he'd already confirmed. The woman in the truck must have had her radio on. Small towns move information faster than lightning. What are you doing with 20 barn cats on a place this size? You'll be feeding them from now till doomsday. I told him I wasn't planning on feeding them much at all. He gave a short, humorless laugh. They'll starve or they'll wander off. Either way, you just took on a problem. He started his truck. You know, the extension agent was just out at my place. We were talking about grain storage. He's got a new bait station system. Patented, seals tight, guarantees less than 2% loss over winter. You ought to have him come out. Better than collecting strays. He put the truck in gear. You do what you want, but that's a strange kind of charity. Then he drove off. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. I was running a cat sanctuary. I was a crazy old man who'd lost his senses after his wife passed. They weren't being cruel, not really. It was just gossip, the way a small town fills its quiet hours. I knew what they were saying because the kid from the extension office showed up around 3. He was young, earnest, had a degree from the state university, and carried a laminated binder. He introduced himself, said he'd heard I might be having a pest problem, and wanted to offer the county's services. He had charts. He had graphs. He showed me the data on rodent damage, on spoilage from moisture their activity creates in a grain bin. He said, "Sir, based on the age of your bins and the typical infestation rates in this county, you're probably looking at a 12 to 15% loss of your stored corn this winter. That's real money. A few cats. Well, that's a sentimental solution, but it's not a practical one. We can set you up with a comprehensive rodent abatement program. It's scientific." He meant well. He was just a boy who believed in the numbers on his page. He saw a problem and had a product to sell as the solution. He saw me as an old farmer who didn't understand the modern world. I thanked him for his time. I told him I was trying something different this year. He got that same look in his eye the woman from the shelter had. Pity. He left me a glossy brochure and went on his way. I stood there as the sun started to dip below the tree line, the light turning thin and gold. I could feel the eyes on me, not from the neighbors, not anymore, from the shadows. Under the granary in the hayloft, behind the woodpile. 20 pairs of them, the watchers. I only knew what my grandfather had tried to tell me 40 years ago, standing right here on this same piece of ground. I was just hoping I'd remembered it right. I want to be honest about my reasons. It wasn't just sentiment. I'm not a man who can afford to keep 20 pets for the company. Every animal on this place has to earn its keep, one way or another. That's the hard math of a small farm. The cats weren't charity. They were an investment. An old-fashioned, high-risk, long-shot investment that everyone else thought was foolish. But the idea didn't come from a university study or a glossy brochure. It came from my grandfather. He was a man who moved slow, spoke little, and paid attention to everything. He could tell you when it was going to rain by the way the cows stood in the pasture. He could tell you the health of a field by the color of the soil on his boot. He didn't trust anything that came in a box with a long list of instructions. He trusted what he could see and touch and learn from over seasons. I remember one winter I must have been about 12 years old. We were in the big barn, the one that still stands by the creek. It was cold enough to see your breath, and the air smelled of hay and dust. It found a sack of seed corn that had been chewed open. A river of yellow kernels spilled across the wooden floor. Rats. He just stood there looking at it for a long time. Not angry, just thoughtful. I expected him to go get the traps or the poison. That's what everyone did. Instead, he crouched down and picked up a single kernel. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. "Nature always collects its tax," he said to me, his voice quiet. "There's the farmer's share and there's nature's share. You can't ever get rid of nature's share. You just get to choose who pays it. You can pay it to the rats and the mice and the rot they bring, or you can pay it to the watchers." I asked him what watchers he meant. He just looked up toward the rafters of the old barn, where a pair of barn owls sometimes nested. He pointed with his chin toward the barn door, where a lean, striped cat was cleaning its paws in a patch of sunlight. "The ones who work for a living," he said. "The ones who keep the books balanced." That was it. That was the whole lesson. He never mentioned it again, but it stuck with me. The idea that you didn't fight nature. You worked with it. You managed the tax. The next morning, I went looking for his notebooks. After my father passed, I'd cleaned out the old farmhouse and moved most of his and my grandfather's things into storage crates in the barn office. I confess, I'd put it off. Going through an old man's things is a heavy task. It feels like you're trespassing in a life that's already over. But now I had a reason. The office was cold, smelling of damp paper and oil from the can on the workbench. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 5 marbled composition books. His farm ledgers, his careful, slanted handwriting filled every page. For hours I sat there on an overturned bucket, a single bare bulb hanging overhead. It was all there. The life of this farm, recorded in numbers and short, declarative sentences, the 10th of April, 1968. Planted. The South 40. Seed corn from the co-op, variety 34B. Soils a bit wet. The 22nd of July, 1971. Corn is firing. Might lose the hilltops. The 5th of October, 1974. First frost. Beans are in. 42 bushels to the acre. Good year. It was a history of weather and work, but I was looking for something specific. I flipped to the back pages of each notebook, where he kept his year-end summaries. Bushels harvested, bushels sold, bushels stored, and then the number that mattered, winter loss. A calculation of what he put in the bins in the fall versus what he took out in the spring. The numbers were steady. 10%, 12%. One bad year, it was nearly 20%. A tax, paid to the rats and the damp. They brought with them, he'd tried things. I saw notes about tin flashing around the foundations, about new traps, about a poison he'd bought from the co-op that he noted didn't seem to do much. It was fighting a war he couldn't win. Then, in the last notebook, from the final year he farmed, I found it. It was on the very last page after the final tally of his harvest. He'd written down the number, an estimated 14%, but underneath it, he had written 2 words, circled them, and put a question mark next to them. The handwriting was a little shaky. It just said, "The Watchers?" It was a question he was asking himself, a problem he hadn't solved. A piece of the puzzle he knew was missing. He'd understood the principle of the tax, but he'd never been able to put the right collectors to work. He'd had a cat or two, like every farm, but he'd never committed to the idea. He'd never assembled a crew. He'd never gone out and hired a full-time professional security force. The single bulb overhead hummed in the quiet barn. Outside, the wind had picked up. I thought I heard the scratch of claws on the roof shingles. He'd left me the problem, written down on a piece of paper, and I had 20 answers hiding in the shadows of his farm. It was time to see if the old man was right. It was time to conduct an experiment. An idea is one thing, proof is another. I knew what the kid from the extension office believed. If I was going to prove them wrong, I couldn't just rely on a feeling or a 40-year-old memory. I needed numbers, hard numbers, the kind my grandfather would have written down in his ledger, so I decided to set up a controlled test. Behind the machine shed there were 2 old steel grain bins, smaller ones, maybe 300 bushels each. They were identical, sitting side by side on matching concrete pads. They were perfect for my purpose. The first weekend in December, I set to work. It was cold, exacting labor. I swept them out, clearing away the old husks and the dust of forgotten harvests. I checked the seals on the access hatches, patching any obvious holes with roofing tar, just as the extension agent's brochure recommended. I was going to follow the modern method on one and the old method on the other. On the first bin, the control bin, I made it as rodent-proof as a man could. I sealed every seam I could find. I made it a fortress. This was the bin that science and the co-op would approve of. This was Dale's bin. On the second bin, I did the opposite. After checking it for structural soundness, I took my metal shears and, down near the concrete pad, I cut 4 small, deliberate holes. Each one was about 5 inches in diameter, just big enough for a cat to slip through. I smoothed the edges so they wouldn't get cut. I was installing 4 cat doors. I was putting out a welcome mat. My wife, if she'd still been around, would have said I was losing my mind. But she also would have trusted me to finish what I started. The following Tuesday, I brought the auger around. I had a wagon full of shelled corn from this year's harvest, all of it from the same section of the south field, to ensure the moisture content and quality were identical. I filled the control bin. First, I climbed the ladder. 300 bushels of clean, yellow corn, filled to the brim. I sealed the top hatch tight. Then I filled the second bin, the cat bin. The same amount of the same corn. When I was done, I left it cracked just enough for ventilation and for access. I wanted the scent of that grain to travel on the winter wind. I wanted it to be an invitation, but I also wanted the new residents of my farm to know that their place of business was open. That evening, I started my own notebook, a new, clean one. On the first page, I wrote the date, the 8th of December, 1998. Bin 1, sealed, 300 bushels. Bin 2, vented, cat access, 300 bushels. Objective, measure winter loss. For the first few weeks, nothing happened. The snow came, blanketing the farm in a thick layer of white. It was quiet. The cats were mostly invisible. I'd see their tracks in the snow, a complex network of trails leading from the barn to the corn crib, from the machine shed to the woodpile, They never came to the back door. They never asked for anything. I put out dry food in the barn, a big bag of it, and I kept the water pans from freezing over. They ate some of it, but they never seemed hungry. They were hunting. I'd find the evidence. A feather here, a tuft of fur there. They were at work. I started walking the property at night with a flashlight. It was a strange thing to do. Walking your own land in the dark. You notice things you miss in the daylight. The way the shadows fall, the sounds the buildings make as the temperature drops. And I started to see them. A flash of eyes from the top of a fence post. A silent shape moving along the beam in the hayloft. They had established a perimeter. They had divided the farmstead into territories. They were on patrol. The big Ginger Tom with the one eye. He seemed to have claimed the main barn as his own. A calico and her 2 grown kittens worked the area around the corn crib. They had organized themselves. It wasn't a random collection of strays anymore. It was a security force. One night in late January, during a bitter cold snap, I walked out to the 2 test bins. The moon was full on the snow, and the world was lit in shades of silver and blue. I swept the flashlight beam across the base of the control bin, the fortress, and there they were. Tracks. Tiny, perfect tracks of field mice leading right up to the foundation. They had found a way in. I knew they would. They always do. I put my ear to the steel wall of the bin. I couldn't hear anything but the wind, but I knew they were in there, feasting, building nests, having families, paying the tax. Then I walked over to the second bin. I swept the light along its base. There were cat tracks everywhere, a beaten path leading to the 4 holes I'd cut. It looked like a highway, but there were no mouse tracks. It was as if a dead line had been drawn in the snow about 10 feet out from the bin, and no rodent dared to cross it. The scent of the cats was a wall. I put my ear to that bin. It was silent, too. But it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of a sealed tomb. It was the silence of a guarded place, a protected place. I went back inside and made a note in my ledger. The 26th of January. Rodent activity at bin. The rest of the winter passed slowly, as it always does. The deep cold of February gave way to the wet, muddy ground of March. The cats remained a quiet presence. They had grown sleek and confident. They moved with a purpose that hadn't been there when they'd first arrived. Hunched and wary in their cages, they were no longer strays. They were the farm's maintenance crew. They knew every inch of this place, every hiding spot, every potential entryway for the things they were hired to hunt. I saw them less often, but I felt their presence more. The farm was changing in subtle ways. The usual signs of spring rodent activity. The little tunnels in the dirt along the barn foundation. The chewed corner of a bag of fertilizer in the shed. They weren't there this year. The place felt cleaner, tighter. Dale drove by a few times. He'd slow down, but he didn't stop. I think he was looking for evidence of my failure. A yard full of scrawny, starving cats. He never saw it. He just saw the same old farm, looking a little more tidy than usual. He couldn't see what was really happening. He couldn't see the invisible work that was being done every night. In April, when the ground was firm enough to move the trucks around, I decided it was time to see the results. It was the day I had to empty the big bins to sell the grain to the co-op before planting season began. This was the real test. The 2 small bins were my experiment, but the 3 large silos held my livelihood. I hadn't cut cat doors into those. They were too big, too modern. But they weren't new. They were 15 years old, and I knew for a fact they weren't rodent-proof. Every spring when I opened them, I knew I'd find the same thing. Caked, spoiled grain near the walls, evidence of nesting, and the unmistakable sour smell of infestation. It was the cost of doing business. But this year the cats had been patrolling the foundations of those big bins. All winter long. I had seen their tracks. I had seen them sitting on the concrete pads, patient as stones. The grain inspector from the co-op was a man named Abernathy. He was my age, maybe a few years older. He'd been testing grain for 40 years. He'd seen it all. He didn't talk much. He arrived in a dusty sedan, carrying a long brass probe and a set of metal sieves. He didn't say hello. He just nodded and said, "Let's see what you've got." We went to the first big bin. I started the auger, and a golden stream of corn began to pour into the truck. Abernathy took his probe and plunged it deep into the flowing grain, pulling out a long core sample. He let it run through his fingers, smelling it, feeling its weight and texture. He ran it through his moisture tester. He nodded. "Standard," he said. It was what he always said. We moved to the second bin. Same process. Same result, standard. Then we came to the third bin, the one closest to the barn. The one that was the center of the cat's territory. I started the auger. The corn began to flow. And then he stopped. He went quiet. This was not a man who paused. He was a man of efficiency, of constant motion. But he stood there, frozen for a long second, the grain pouring over his boots. He let the corn in his hand sift through his fingers very, very slowly. He looked at it. Then he looked up at me. He looked at the base of the bin. His eyes, trained by 40 years of looking for imperfections, were seeing something unusual. He took another sample, this time from deeper in the flow. He held it up to the pale morning light. He sifted it again. "What did you do here?" he asked. His voice was flat, curious. It wasn't an accusation. It was a professional inquiry. "I got some cats," I told him. He didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just looked at the corn again. He rubbed a few kernels between his thumb and forefinger, breaking them open. He sniffed them. Then he delivered his verdict. It was one word, but it was the word I'd been waiting 4 months to hear. "Tight," he said. I asked him what he meant. "No fines," he said, not looking at me, but at the grain. No cracked kernels from chewing, no webbing. No moisture tracks, no smell. This is as clean a sample as I've pulled all year. It's like it came out of a brand new bin." He went to his car and came back with his clipboard. He made a note, circling a number on his grading sheet. "You'll get a premium for this," he said. "Quality's high, spoilage is non-existent." He packed up his gear, handed me my copy of the report, and drove away. I stood there in the quiet, the dust from the grain settling around me. A premium. I hadn't gotten a premium on my stored grain in 20 years. The tax had always been too high. But this year, the books were balanced. The watchers had done their job. The check from the co-op was the proof on paper. The premium Abernathy had noted wasn't a fortune, but it was substantial. It was enough to buy all the seed for the spring planting, and then some. I did the math in my grandfather's old ledger. Right below his final entry, I calculated the average bushel price, the bonus I'd received, and what it meant across the thousands of bushels I'd sold. Then I calculated what I would have lost. If the extension agent's 15% estimate was right, the number was staggering. It would have wiped out my entire profit for the year. Even at my grandfather's historical average of 12%, it was a heavy tax. The cats hadn't just saved me a little grain, they had saved the farm, but the final piece of proof was still waiting for me in the 2 small bins behind the machine shed. That afternoon I went out there with a small auger and 2 empty wagons. I was the only one who would ever know the results of this private experiment. But to me, it was the most important part. I opened the control bin first, the one I had sealed so carefully. As soon as I cracked the hatch, the smell hit me, that sour, musty odor of rodent infestation. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was there. As the grain augured out, I saw the evidence. Clumps of spoiled caked corn, droppings, nests made of chewed husks and insulation from the bin walls. It was exactly what I expected. When the bin was empty, I weighed the wagon. I had put 300 bushels in. A loss of 42 bushels, 14%. The modern method, the scientific approach, had failed. The fortress had been breached, and the thieves had taken their share. The air that came out smelled clean. It smelled like dry corn and nothing else. I started the auger. The grain that flowed out was bright and clean. Just like the corn from the big silo, it poured into the wagon, a clean, uniform stream. I watched until the very end, waiting for the clumps, the nests, the evidence of loss. There was none. The bin was clean. Not a single dropping, not a single spoiled kernel. A loss of less than 3 bushels. Less than 1%. And that was likely just moisture loss. The natural drying that happens over a long winter. The cats had provided near-perfect protection. The tax had been paid, but it was paid to them in the form of the mice they'd caught before they ever reached the bin. They had guarded the treasure, and their only fee was the hunt itself. I stood there for a long time looking at the 2 empty bins. One, a failure, the other, a success. The difference wasn't technology. It wasn't poison. The difference was a 40-year-old piece of wisdom and 20 unwanted animals. I wrote the final numbers down in my notebook, right next to the first entry. I closed the book and put it on the shelf next to my grandfather's. The experiment was over. The verdict was in. A few days later, I was out mending the fence along the road when Dale's clean truck pulled up. He stopped, just as he had that first day. He watched me stretch the wire for a minute, the tensioner groaning. "Heard you got a premium down at the coop," he said. It wasn't a question. Grain was clean, I said, not looking at him, just focusing on wrapping the wire around the post. I could feel him watching me. He was processing it, trying to make it fit with what he knew about bait stations and modern science. It didn't fit. "Abernathy said it was the cleanest he's seen all season," Dale said. He'd been asking around. Of course he had. I finished the wrap and gave the wire a pluck. It sang with the right tension. I finally looked over at him. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, toward the barn. The big, one-eyed Ginger Tom was sitting on the stone foundation, washing its face in the afternoon sun. It looked like it owned the place. Dale watched the cat for a long moment. He shook his head just a little. "Place seems quieter," he said. It was the closest he would ever come to admitting he was wrong. It was more than enough. He put the truck in gear and drove away a little slower than usual. I watched him go, then turned back to my work. The sun was warm on my back. The farm was quiet. And it was protected. That night, I sat in the old barn office, the door open to the cool spring air. The single bulb overhead cast a warm yellow light on the two notebooks, open on the workbench, my grandfather's and mine. His was filled with the wisdom of a lifetime. Mine had only a few pages detailing one winter's experiment. But they told the same story. A story about paying attention. I looked at his last entry again. The two circled words. The Watchers. He knew the problem. He sensed the solution. But he never had the chance to prove it. He never assembled the crew. It felt, in that quiet moment, like I had finished a sentence he had started a long time ago. I took my pen, and in my own notebook, under the final tally of the grain weights, I wrote one last line. The tax was paid. I thought about the kid from the extension office with his charts and his certainty. He wasn't wrong about the problem. His numbers on potential loss were dead on. Where he was wrong was in the solution. He believed in fighting a war against nature, in sealing it out, poisoning it, trying to eradicate it. My grandfather's way, the way of the cats, wasn't about war. It was about balance. It wasn't about eradication. It was about management. The modern world wants to sell you a product in a box that promises a final solution. But the land doesn't work that way. There are no final solutions. There are only cycles. There are only systems. The rats and the mice are part of the system. The cats are too. The mistake wasn't the presence of the rats. It was the absence of their predators. I hadn't done anything new. I had just restored a piece of the system that had been removed. I had hired the right workers for the job, and the only wage they asked for was the work itself. I closed the notebooks and put them back in the cedar chest. Their work was done. I walked out of the office and stood in the center of the barn. The air was sweet with the smell of old hay and warming earth. A half-dozen cats were scattered around the hayloft, sleeping. They weren't my pets. I couldn't walk up and scratch one behind the ears. We didn't have that kind of relationship. It was a professional arrangement. I provided a base of operations, water, and a little supplemental food as a retainer. They provided a level of security no poison or trap could ever match. They were a living, breathing, self-replicating pest control system. They worked for themselves, but their work benefited me. It was a perfect contract. The big ginger tomcat hopped down from a beam and walked past me, not even giving me a glance. He stopped at the big barn door, looked out into the deepening twilight, and then slipped out into the night to begin his shift. He knew his territory. He was part of something that worked. My grandfather had written that nature always collects its tax. He was right. For years I had been paying that tax to the thieves. This year, I'd finally learned to pay the guards instead. It's a simple lesson. but it's one that seems to get forgotten in a world full of glossy brochures and guaranteed results. Sometimes the oldest solutions are the best ones. Sometimes the answer isn't a new product, but a restoration of an old balance. Sometimes the most valuable thing on a farm isn't the crop in the field or the machinery in the shed, but the silent, watchful partners who work in the shadows while you sleep. They keep the books balanced. They make sure the only share that gets taken is the one that's owed. They're the watchers, and I'm glad they're on my side. If you've got your own crew of watchers, your own overlooked solution that the modern world has forgotten, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Subscribe if this meant something to you. The weeks after the harvest and a quiet vindication settled into the comfortable rhythm of spring planting. The ground was ready, and so was I. There's a hope that comes with that time of year, a feeling that you're getting a fresh start. But this year, it felt different. It wasn't just the hope of a good crop. It was the quiet confidence of a system that was working. As I worked the fields, I'd see them. A flash of calico at the edge of the woods. A black cat, still as a statue. Watching a gopher hole in the pasture, they weren't just barn cats anymore. Their territory had expanded. They were working the whole farm. Their presence changed my own relationship with the land. I started paying more attention, the way my grandfather had. I noticed the small things. The lack of deer nibbling on the new soybean shoots near the barn. The absence of rabbits in the vegetable garden my wife had always kept. It wasn't just the grain they were protecting everything. Their silent patrols created a kind of buffer zone, a perimeter of security that extended out from the barn in all directions. One morning I was replacing a broken hydraulic line on the planter, my hands covered in grease, when the young extension agent pulled into the yard. It was the same earnest kid from the fall. He had his clipboard. He got out of his car with a hesitant smile. "Morning," he said. "Just doing my spring follow-ups. Wanted to see how that abatement program worked out for you." He was expecting to find a man who had paid the price for his stubbornness, a man ready to listen to reason. I wiped my hands on a rag and leaned against the big tractor tire. "It worked out just fine," I told him. "Losses were minimal." He looked surprised. "Really? So, the traps you set—" "Didn't set any traps," I said. "Or the bait stations. Didn't use any bait." He frowned, confused. He looked at his data sheet as if the answer might be printed there. "So what did you do?" "I told you last fall," I said. "I hired a crew. Right on cue, one of the lean tabby cats, a female with a notched ear, trotted out from under the corn crib with a field mouse in her mouth. She didn't even look at us. She had a job to do. She was taking her payment to her kittens, who were likely tucked away in some safe, warm spot. The young man watched her go, his mouth slightly open. He looked from the cat to the solid-looking grain bins, to me. The certainty he'd worn like a uniform back in November was gone. He was seeing something that wasn't in his textbook. "Huh," he said. It was a small sound, but it was the sound of a mind opening just a crack. "So they really made a difference?" "They're the only thing that did," I said. I told him the numbers from my Tubin experiment. I told them about the premium I got from Abernathy. I didn't gloat. I just stated the facts, plain and simple, the way my grandfather would have. He wrote it all down, not on his official form, but in a little spiral notebook he pulled from his shirt pocket. He was thinking now, not just reciting. "We don't have a protocol for this," he said, almost to himself. "There's no box to check for feral cat colony." I told him maybe there should be. He stayed for another 20 minutes, asking questions. Not about data and percentages, but about the cats themselves. How many? What did I feed them? Did they cause any problems? It was a real conversation. When he left, he shook my hand. "You've given me something to think about," he said. He wasn't a convert, not yet, but a seed of doubt had been planted in the hard soil of his modern certainty. That, to me, was a victory as real as the check from the co-op. It was a sign that the old ways weren't dead. They were just quiet. They didn't come with a marketing budget. Their proof wasn't in a brochure, but in the results you could see with your own eyes. If you were willing to look as the summer wore on, the farm thrived. The corn grew tall, and the beans filled out their pods. The cats, for their part, raised another generation. The 20 I had started with had become closer to 30, but the population seemed to stabilize there. They were managing their own numbers based on the resources available. They were a self-sustaining system. They taught me another lesson my grandfather knew instinctively. The land has a carrying capacity. It will support what it can support, and no more. You don't have to manage every detail. Sometimes you just have to provide the right conditions and get out of the way. The story of the cats became a quiet legend in the area. Dale never mentioned it to me again, but I heard from the man at the feed store that Dale had started turning a blind eye to the strays that showed up at his own place. He'd even put out a bowl of water for them. He would never admit it, but he was learning the lesson. He was starting to understand the tax. And me, I learned to see my farm, not just as a collection of fields and buildings, but as a complete ecosystem. A place where every creature had a role, a purpose. The bees in the clover, the hawks in the sky, the earthworms in the soil, and the cats in the shadows. They were all part of the crew. The farm was no longer just a place of work. It was a place of partnership. And as I sat on my porch in the evenings, watching the sun go down, I would see them start their nightly patrols, and I felt a deep sense of peace. The watchers were on duty. The accounts were balanced. The farm was safe.